All right, so let's get started with the American Revolution. So we're is since we're looking at world history, we're not going to go into a lot of details here about the American Revolution, but we are going to talk about cause and effect. So, what are some of the causes of the American Revolution? The main cause is that the American colonists, who were British citizens, felt that Britain was not respecting their rights as citizens. And this all goes back to this war, right? So there's this war in the 1750s and 60s called the Seven Years' War. In the United States history, it's called the French and Indian War. And it was France versus Britain. They fought in North America. They fought in India. They fought in the Caribbean for territories, for colonies, for land. And the problem was that Britain ran up a lot of debt, right? So they owed a lot of money. They spent too much money on these wars. So they decided that they're going to make the most out of their colonies and get that money. And this, of course, makes perfect sense because, they're practicing mercantilism. And remember, we talked about mercantilism in the last time period, but that's basically the economic theory that says that, you have the mother country, you have the colonies, and the colonies give all their wealth to the mother country. And the mother country basically controls the trade in and out of the colonies, what is exported, what is imported. And so these mercantile policies put a lot of restrictions on the American colonies. And the problem was that for the previous, 100 years before the revolution breaks out, those 13 colonies were self-governed, meaning that they passed their own laws, they raised their own taxes, they provided for their own defenses. And now the British are saying, you got to pay us. You got to pay us. You got to pay us. And you can't buy, sugar from anyone else. You have to buy it from the British. You can't buy tea from anyone else. You got to buy it from the British. You can't buy clothing. You have to buy it from the British. You can't sell your crops. You have to sell it only to the British. So these mercantile restrictions angered the American colonists because it was, taking away their rights. And on top of that, even though they're citizens of Great Britain, they don't get to vote. And that's where we see the big famous phrase, no taxation without representation. They don't get to vote for their leaders, for a representative. And remember, England is the constitutional monarchy. England has the parliament. England has people who represent the people, but not the American colonies. So the Americans are mad that the British are disrespecting their rights. And so they feel that they have these natural rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And they say that when the government fails to protect those rights, you can change the government. And that's where we get the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the Declaration of Independence says those exact things, right? But the person who wrote it, which is Thomas Jefferson, those aren't his ideas necessarily. That's John Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Voltaire, right? All those Enlightenment guys. Those ideas are found in the Declaration of Independence, right? So the whole concept of that social contract, right? We give the government rights, the government protects us, but if it fails, we can change the government. And that's what the Declaration of Independence was all about. So they want to kick out the British because they feel the British government has failed them, right? You have failed these colonies. So they kick out the British with the Declaration of Independence. They go to war. They fight the American Revolutionary War, War of Independence, 7 years fighting, 8 years fighting. George Washington wins, blah, blah, blah. And then we see the creation of a new government. And it's really like this mind-boggling, earth-shattering event in world history. Because we have a constitutional republic. We haven't had like a republic since like the Romans, 2,000 years earlier. So now the United States creates a constitution. And in that constitution, we see those Enlightenment ideas, right? They're not just theories anymore. They're actually put into law, right? Things like separating the powers into three branches, having checks and balances, having a Bill of Rights that says people have freedoms and rights and you can't take them away, right? So these ideas of the Enlightenment are put into reality with the United States Constitution, with the creation of the United States government. But it doesn't mean that it applied to everyone. So when they talk about all men are created equal, they're really just talking about wealthy white men. Because if you weren't wealthy white men, you really couldn't vote, and you wouldn't have the same rights. So the American Revolution changes who's in charge of the colonies, right? So instead of having the British in charge of the colonies, you had the, wealthy white men in charge of the colonies. And in fact, all the founding fathers were wealthy white men. All the founding fathers were educated. All the founding fathers were, knowledgeable of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and everything else. So this upper class group leads the revolution, right? They gain support from the lower classes, from the poor. They gain support from, of course, the women. They gain support from even natives and Africans. But once they're in charge, when they give freedom and equality and rights, they just give it to themselves. Over time, poor people will gain rights, poor men will gain rights, but it will take, 80 years before slavery comes to an end. And African men, black men are given rights and the right to vote. And it'll take over 120 years before women are given the right to vote. So the American Revolution doesn't really change much. It takes, it starts to change, but it will take another 100, 120 years before, there is more and more equality, right? Which is kind of the big promise of the revolution. But overall, not a big drastic change. Wealthy white guys were in charge before. Now a new group of wealthy white guys are in charge. And that's pretty much it. All right, so that's it for part 2. See you next time.